in a way, the dramatic news we got last night, Jerome, which was that the submersible Titan had, in fact, almost certainly imploded at the bottom of its descent to where the Titanic was in the North Atlantic there on Sunday, the day it submerged. In a way, getting that news, I mean, it was horrific, but in a way, it was good news, because what we were able to deduce from that was that these 5 souls, these 5 men who went down there, would have died absolutely instantaneously, not knowing about it. So in other words, the horrific drama that we had imagined, that they were down there slowly running out of air, knowing that they were at the countdown to death, as it were, that didn't actually happen. So I think that will be some comfort for their families.
Absolutely. I mean, that's about that is the consolation, that if this happened when the submarine moments before the submarine after the submarine last made contact, then it would have been instantaneous. You're absolutely right. The risk with a situation like a missing submersible in that depth of water is that the families may have been left guessing, may have never known what happened. But it certainly seems now that there is an answer. It's a tragic answer. It's an incredibly sad story. But as you say, it would have been instantaneous for the 5 men on board. And
for the families and the grieving loved ones of the poor people who perished, had we not have found the craft, had we have not known what actually happened, the speculation would have been very painful for them. And frankly, it would have gone on forever. It would have been one of those great mysteries, whatever happened to the Titanic 5. So we know what happened, and it is good to bring these stories to some kind of conclusion, however tragic.
I think the next stage will be a discussion that's already really started, which is about trying to work out, the mechanics, the physics of why this went wrong. And there have been questions about whether or not the Titan was seaworthy for such a difficult voyage, down to depths of 3,800 meters, 380 atmospheres. The pressures that it would have required to resist inside that capsule were immense. And we know from speaking to people who've been on similar trips before, members of people who'd left the company OceanGate, that there were concerns about the fact that submarine hadn't been sort of formally classified, hadn't been tested or measured by any independent agency. And the Coast Guard have said, the US Coast Guard have said, that those conversations are already taking place. But of course, that's something that's going to take time, and they may get an answer depending on what bits of the Titan they can salvage. They may be able to reconstruct what happened and know why it failed.
And it was an implosion, the opposite of an explosion, but the effect is the same. I don't think, as far as I can work out, that sadly there'll be no chance of finding any remains, because there's a kind of vaporizing effect that happens when a chamber like that just suddenly implodes at that depth. But I think the big question I'd like to ask you, and I think the big question hanging in the air, and OceanGate really do have to answer this. The sub started its descent at 8 a.m. on Sunday. By 9:45, we'd lost contact. It stopped pinging back messages. Funny enough, apparently it pinged back text messages. They stopped. OceanGate did not raise the alarm for 8 hours? That's extraordinary, isn't it?
It does seem extraordinary. And perhaps, well, we'll have to find out. I mean, I'm speculating here, but perhaps it's because they knew there had been a catastrophic event. I mean, that seems to me the only explanation why they wouldn't raise the alarm immediately to mobilise a search and rescue, is if they knew that it was game over already.
Yeah, because we're learning today that the US coast, including where the Titanic is, not surprisingly, is monitored by extremely sophisticated sonar and tracking technology to guard against possible, Russian, Chinese subs coming close to the United States. Now, that's a round-the-clock thing, and we're being told that on Sunday they heard evidence of this implosion. So that'll be an interesting debate as well. I mean, if they sort of knew from day one, why keep the world on the edge of its seat, biting its nail for 4.5 days?
Well, I think one of the things to say about, underwater sounds, you're absolutely right. There are, across the seabed around the world, underwater microphones which exist to detect hostile submarines. The Royal Navy, the UK uses similar technology. They don't talk about it. America uses similar technology. But nonetheless, analysing those sounds is not it's fairly precise. There's a lot of science behind it, but you can't be certain. And I would imagine that the Coast Guards would not want to have ruled out any hope of finding these people alive until they could prove it categorically. And whilst they may have believed that there was strong evidence that the craft had imploded, and whilst many submarine experts that I spoke to over the course of this rescue were bleak from the get-go of the prospects of the crew surviving, nonetheless, it's understandable that those people involved in the rescue would want to do everything they can while there was still a chance of bringing people back alive.
Sure, absolutely. And a quick word about the 5 people who died. We're learning that the 19-year-old son of one of the very rich passengers was terrified of this journey. The others, these are rich adventurers who want to do it. There's been a lot of talk about, they shouldn't be able to do this. I'm circumspect about this. I think people should be allowed to do this kind of thing. But I assume that from now on there might be rather more stringent safety checks on the vessels that go down there.
I think it's right we have this conversation. I think ultimately, there is a human instinct to explore and adventure. Now, that instinct exists in different levels in different people, but I think for species-wide, it's an essential instinct because it's driven some of the human race's greatest explorations and discoveries. So we shouldn't try and hamper or hinder that. Of course, there are questions over whether or not it was safe. I mean, for me, the greatest consolation of this story is that the Dawood father and son, Shahzada and Suleman Dawood, they were killed instantly. The idea of those two, the father and son, having 96 hours to contemplate their faith, and clearly one would have been more enthusiastic than the other. So I take some solace from the fact that they didn't have to spend 4 days contemplating their end.
As I say, it's a strange thing to say, but it's almost good news that they died instantly and didn't have to slowly face the prospect of death with the clock ticking. Now, I mean, that is an unimaginable horror. Let me ask you a last question, sort of personal question, really. What do you think about, a lot of people have raised concerns about the morality of going down to look at the Titanic, which in the end, I suppose, is a kind of sacred marine burial ground for hundreds of souls. People say, morally, you shouldn't do that. I'm not sure about that, because people go to, there are lots and lots of package holidays to northern France to see the battlefields of the First World War. I'm not sure that it's immoral to want to have a look at the Titanic. What do you feel?
No, I don't think it's immoral at all. I mean, I think it will depend slightly on the motivation of why you're visiting it, and perhaps the conduct of the way those visits are conducted. But you're absolutely right that people visit historical sites, people visit historical graves all the time, and very often that's in order to understand the history of what happened, in order to pay respects to the people who are buried there. And the Titanic, of course, it is a gravesite, and it is. We understand that the boats that do go, the submersibles that do go down there, have often kept a respectable distance from the wreck site and from the remains.
Yeah, I just think these 5 people in the end, they've died on the altar of the human adventurous spirit, and I don't think we should try and extinguish that bright light of humanity. So, Jerome, thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you,
That's
Kevin.
Jerome Starkey, defence editor of The Sun.